The grand diplomatic conclave of the hegemony was not a place for mistakes. It floated in the void between stars, a massive ring-shaped station wide enough to hold a small city inside its walls, lit by soft golden light that fell on floors of polished dark stone. 47 species had sent their best people here, their most careful diplomats, their sharpest minds, all dressed in their finest clothes and armor and shells and wrappings. Everyone walked slowly here, spoke quietly, and thought before every single word they said. Sergeant Marcus Hale had been told this 11 times before he boarded the shuttle. He had been told it by his commanding officer, by the diplomatic briefing team, by the nervous young man from Earth's foreign ministry who kept wiping sweat from his forehead, and by the automated voice on the arrival pod that welcomed all new visitors to the conclave, with a reminder to observe proper conduct at all times. Marcus understood the message. He just did not fully understand how serious it was until he walked through the main gates and saw 3 armed Vreth soldiers staring at him with all 6 of their pale eyes, without blinking. Earth had been admitted to the hegemony only 14 months ago. The other species had debated it for a long time before saying yes, and most of them had not been enthusiastic about it. Humans were too young, too loud, too emotional, too unpredictable. They did not live long enough to understand the galaxy, said the Sci-Fi in their formal rejection letter, which was later overturned by a narrow vote. Humans were admitted on a probationary basis, which meant no voting rights, no military alliances, and absolutely no causing trouble at diplomatic events. Marcus was Earth's first ever military cultural attaché, which was a title someone had made up 3 weeks before his deployment, because no such role had existed before. His job was to stand near the human delegation and look professional, which he did well, and to not say anything that would start a war, which was harder than it sounded. The conclave hall assigned to the Sci-Fi delegation was on the east arc of the station, behind tall doors made of black crystal that caught the light, split it into colors that had no names in any human language. The Sci-Fi were the most powerful empire in the known galaxy. They controlled trade routes across 1/3 of all charted space, commanded fleets that could crack moons open, and had been building their civilization for 30,000 years before humans had invented the wheel. Their queen, Zathara Voss the Undying, was said to be over 200 years old. She had not attended a conclave in person since before Marcus's great-grandfather was born. The fact that she was here now, in person, had every delegation on edge. Marcus stood at his assigned post, near the archway that connected the human section of the hall to the long corridor leading toward the Sci-Fi wing. His job was simple. Stand there, look respectful, do not speak unless spoken to. He had been doing it for 4 hours without incident. Then the corridor filled with a sound like wind moving through crystal pipes, soft and layered, and not quite like music, but close to it, and the Sci-Fi procession began to move. They came in a long line, tall and slow and silent, their carapaces catching light in iridescent waves of color that shifted from deep blue to gold to green, depending on how they moved. Their 6 limbs moved in perfect coordination, and the sound of their steps was so soft it barely reached his ears. Marcus had seen images of the Sci-Fi in briefing files. He had studied their biology, their social structure, their history. He had practiced the correct way to lower his eyes when one passed close to him. None of that prepared him for seeing them move in person. And then the queen passed the far end of the archway, and everything Marcus had studied went quiet in his head. She was taller than the others by a full head, and her carapace was not blue-gold like the rest, but a deep shifting color that sat somewhere between violet and black, moving like oil on dark water. Her compound eyes caught the gold light of the hall and held it, and the way she moved was not like walking at all, but like something that had never needed to hurry, because it had never needed to be anywhere other than exactly where it was. Marcus forgot he was on an open comm channel. He forgot he was at a diplomatic event, watched by 11 other species. He forgot everything his commanding officer had told him 11 times. He leaned very slightly toward Corporal Dana Reyes, who was standing 2 feet to his left, and he whispered 5 words. He said, "She is absolutely stunning." The human comm channel went dead silent. Not the silence of empty space, but the silence of 8 people holding their breath at the same time. Marcus noticed the silence first. Then he noticed the shadow. It fell across the floor in front of him, long and angular and wrong, because the corridor behind him had been empty when he last checked, and there was no reason for a shadow to be coming from that direction. He turned his head slowly. The Queen of the Zethari Empire was standing 3 feet behind him. She had doubled back from the procession without a sound. Her compound eyes were fixed on him, with an expression he had no training to read. Her translator implant, a small silver device set just below her left eye, was blinking gold. Gold meant active. Gold meant she had heard him. Gold meant she understood every word. Around the hall, 12 Zethari guards raised their weapons in perfect unison, the sound of it sharp and precise and very loud in the sudden quiet. The human delegation, visible through the far archway, had gone completely still. Marcus Hale stood there, alone between raised weapons, and a queen who was looking at him like he was something she had never seen before. And he realized with perfect clarity that no briefing file in the history of Earth's diplomatic service had ever covered this exact situation. Every species in the conclave hall had a word for what happened next. The Vreth called it a provocation. The Solari called it a terminal error. The Dreshkai ambassadors who had been watching from the upper gallery later wrote in their official report that they had witnessed what they were certain would be the shortest diplomatic career in recorded history. None of them had ever watched a human think under pressure before. Marcus Hale did not run. He did not fall to his knees, which was the acceptable gesture of submission in Zethari protocol when a lower being was caught doing something wrong before the queen. He did not try to explain himself immediately, which the Zethari considered a sign of guilt. He stood completely still for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to take 1 slow breath in and 1 slow breath out. And then he turned to face her fully. He placed his right hand flat over the center of his chest. He dropped into a slow, deep bow, his spine straight, his eyes angled down toward the floor but not fully closed, the way his grandmother had taught him when he was 7 years old and had walked into his aunt's living room without knocking. It was a human gesture. It meant nothing in Zethari formal protocol. But it was unmistakably sincere, and that sincerity crossed every language barrier in the room. When he came back upright, he spoke in a voice that was calm and clear, and not quite as steady as he wanted it to be. He said, "Your Majesty, in my language and in my culture, the word stunning means something that takes your breath away, something so remarkable that for a moment your mind goes quiet and cannot find words except the wrong ones." He paused for exactly 1 second. Then he said, "I meant it as the highest compliment I know how to give." The queen had not moved during any of this. She stood the way ancient mountains stand, with a weight and stillness that made everything around her seem temporary. Her compound eyes moved between his face, his hand still resting on his chest, tremor in his jaw that he could not quite control no matter how steady he kept his voice. Behind her, the 12 guards had not lowered their weapons. Behind Marcus, through the archway, the entire human delegation was holding a silence so total that Ambassador Priya Singh later said she had not breathed for 40 seconds. The translator implant under the queen's eye blinked gold 3 times. Then it went still. Then the queen spoke. Her voice was layered, 2 tones at once, a lower one that vibrated through the floor, and a higher one that rang in the air. And the translator rendered it into standard with a half-second delay that made every word feel heavy. She said, "You are not afraid of me." It was not a question. It was the kind of statement that contains a question inside it, waiting to see what the other person does with it. Marcus answered without thinking. He said, "I am terrified, Your Majesty." He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "But you are still stunning." The hall went so quiet that the distant hum of the station's power core was audible. 3 Vreth diplomats exchanged glances that, in their species, meant they were preparing to take cover. The Dreshkai in the upper gallery stopped writing. Ambassador Singh closed her eyes. Then something happened that had not happened in the presence of a foreign delegation in over 160 years of recorded Zithari diplomatic history. The Queen laughed. It started low, a clicking rhythm deep in her throat, and then it rose and spread into a full sound, sharp and layered and loud, and it shook the crystal panels in the archway walls, and rattled the weapons in the hands of her guards, and filled every corner of the hall with something that felt completely different from anything that had been in that room before. 2 of the Vreth diplomats actually stepped backward. One of the Solari delegates dropped their ceremonial staff. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands still on his chest. Know whether to smile or not, and so he did the only thing that felt right. He smiled. Not a careful smile, not a diplomatic smile, but the small, honest, slightly bewildered smile of a person who has just survived something and is not yet entirely sure how. The Queen's laughter faded into clicks and then into silence. She looked at him for a long time with those vast compound eyes that held light the way deep water holds light, and then she said something to the chief guard in rapid Zithari that the translator did not render aloud. All 12 weapons lowered. She turned back to Marcus and said, in slow standard, "You will come with me." Not a question, not a request. Marcus looked back once toward Ambassador Singh, who was staring at him with the expression of a person watching a ship sail into a storm and being unable to do anything at all about it. He looked back at the Queen. He said, "Yes, Your Majesty." Behind him, as he walked away, he heard Corporal Reyes whisper to the rest of the team in a voice that was barely a breath, "What do we do now?" Nobody had an answer. In every other delegation's secure communications room, messages were already being written home, marked urgent, stamped with the kind of priority codes that woke people from sleep in the middle of the night. Every message said some version of the same thing. It said, "The humans have done something extraordinary, and we do not yet know if it will save them or destroy them." The private chambers assigned to the Zithari Queen were at the deepest part of the station's east arc, past 3 security checkpoints, and through a corridor that had been sealed to all other species for the duration of the conclave. Marcus walked through all of it, with 2 guards flanking him, and the Queen moving ahead, and he kept his breathing steady and his hands at his sides, and his face as neutral as he could make it. The room they entered was large and dark and cool, lit by tall panels that glowed with soft blue-white light that felt like being underwater. There was nothing in it that looked like furniture by any human definition, but there were structures along the walls that the Queen moved toward and settled against in a way that suggested rest. And Marcus stood in the center of the room and waited. The 2 guards took positions outside the door. The door closed. He was alone with her. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking, and he had the strange feeling of being studied the way a scientist studies something genuinely new. Not with hostility, but with a focused, patient attention that had no hurry in it at all. Then she said, "Ask me something." He had not expected that. He said, "I'm sorry?" She said, "You are the first member of your species to stand in a room with me." She paused in a way that felt deliberate. Then she said, "You should use the opportunity." Marcus thought for a moment. There were 100 careful diplomatic questions he had been trained to ask. He did not ask any of them. He said, "How old were you when you became queen?" She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, 42 of your years." He said, "That's young." She said, "It was." She said it in a tone that held a long story inside it, and was not going to tell any of it right now. What followed was 2 hours of the most unusual conversation Marcus had ever had. She asked about human wars, and he told her. About them honestly. About the fact that humans had spent most of their history fighting each other over land and food and ideas, and that many of those wars had been terrible, and that humans were not proud of all of them, but had not stopped having them. She asked about human art, and he tried to explain it, which was harder, because the concept kept coming apart in his hands when he reached for it. He said, "We make things that mean nothing useful." She said, "Meaning nothing useful is a very unusual thing to do with time." He said, "Yes, but it feels important." She considered this for a long time. Then she told him something. She said, "In our language we have no word for beautiful the way you use it." She said, "We have a word that means perfect in function." She said, "We have a word that means powerful enough to be preserved." She said, "We have a word that means worthy of study." She said, "But this thing you describe, where something moves you for no reason that helps you survive, we have no word for that." Marcus said, "How do you talk about things that move you then?" She was quiet for a very long time after that. Then she said, "We do not." He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out his personal tablet, the old one he carried everywhere. The one that technically was not supposed to be on his person during diplomatic events, but that he had forgotten to leave in his bunk. He held it out toward her. He said, "Can I show you something?" She looked at the tablet and then at him, and said nothing, which he decided to treat as a yes. He opened his photos. He showed her the Earth. Not official images, not the kind used in diplomatic presentations. His photos, his city from a rooftop at night, with all the lights scattered below like spilled stars. A street market in the early morning, with fog still on the air and vendors arranging fruit in careful piles. His mother's face at a kitchen table, laughing at something off camera. Her hair gray at the temples, and her eyes creased at the corners. A small child in a park, feeding pigeons from an open hand, completely absorbed in the task. The Queen looked at each image for a long time. She did not speak while she looked. When she reached the photo of the child and the pigeons, she stopped. She said, "What is the purpose of this?" Marcus said, "The child feeding the birds?" She said, "Yes." He said, "There is no purpose." He said the child just wanted to. Another long silence. Then the Queen said something that Marcus would think about for the rest of his life. She said, "Your species spends time on things that have no purpose, and yet you call them important." She said, "You make things that will not survive you, and you still make them." She said, "You feel things you cannot explain, and you still feel them." She stopped. Then she said, very quietly, "We have studied your species for 3 years, and we did not understand any of this until right now." Marcus looked at her. He said, "What did you think of us before?" She said, "We thought you were like young versions of something we already knew." She said, "We were wrong." He asked her then, because he could not stop himself, what she found beautiful. She was quiet for so long that he thought she was not going to answer. Then she said, "Space, when it is completely empty, has a quality that I have no word for." She said, "I'd have stood at the edge of nothing for many hours, more times than I can count, and something happens to me there that I have never been able to explain to anyone." She stopped again. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, and the two tones in it were closer together, almost like a single note. She said, "I did not know that was a kind of beauty until tonight." By the next morning, every delegation at the conclave knew that the human military attaché had been taken for a private audience with the Xythari Queen. The knowledge spread through the station the way heat spreads through metal, fast and invisible and impossible to stop once it had started. The reactions were different depending on which species you asked. The Solari were baffled. The Dreshkai were fascinated. The Vreth were angry. The Vreth Collective had been trying to block Earth's full admission to the hegemony since before the vote 14 months ago. They were the third largest power in the galaxy, old and careful and deeply suspicious of anything they did not already understand. They had decided very early that humans were a problem that would only grow larger if left alone. The private audience gave them exactly what they needed. Before the morning session of the conclave opened, the Vreth First Ambassador filed a formal motion. The motion called for the censure of Earth's delegation. It cited Marcus's words as evidence of deliberate disrespect toward a sovereign ruler. It argued that the incident proved humans were too impulsive, too uncontrolled, and too fundamentally unsuited to the careful work of galactic diplomacy to be trusted with any kind of meaningful participation in the hegemony. The motion called for Earth's delegation to be expelled from the current conclave and for Earth's probationary status to be reviewed, which everyone understood was a formal way of saying it should be revoked. It was a well-built motion, it was logical, and it was supported by the letter of several relevant protocols. And it was the kind of thing that, in the normal course of events, would have gathered enough votes to pass. Ambassador Priya Singh spent the night preparing a defense. She worked with her full team, pulling every relevant precedent, building every argument, rehearsing every counter to every objection the Vreth might raise. She was good at her job. She had been good at her job for 23 years. She knew it might not be enough. Marcus sat in the gallery above the main conclave floor and watched the session begin. He had been told, politely but firmly, that he was not to speak, appear on the floor, or do anything that could be interpreted as further provocation. He sat in the gallery with Corporal Reyes on one side and a very uncomfortable junior diplomat on the other. And he watched the motion be presented, and he watched Ambassador Singh stand and begin to speak. She was halfway through her second argument when the main floor went quiet in a different way. Not the polite quiet of a session in progress. The kind of quiet that happens when something unexpected walks into a room. Queen Zethara Voss entered the conclave floor. She had not been scheduled to appear. No Zethari ruler had ever addressed the full conclave floor directly. It was simply not something that was done. The Zethari communicated through representatives, through carefully crafted written statements, through intermediaries. The queen walked to the center of the floor, and she stood there, and she waited until every voice in the room had gone silent, and every eye, and censor, and translator was fixed on her. Then she spoke. She spoke for 7 minutes. In 200 years of rule, in countless diplomatic engagements, and military actions, and political negotiations, she had never given a public address longer than 3 minutes. She did not speak about military strength. She did not speak about Earth's resources, or its strategic value, or its potential as an ally. She spoke about a child feeding birds in a park. She spoke about a woman laughing at a kitchen table. She spoke about a species that spent its short lives making things that would not outlast them, feeling things they could not explain, saying words they had not calculated, because the truth inside them was stronger than their caution. She said, "This species is not a younger version of anything we already know." She said, "They are something we have not seen before." She said, "The motion before this body calls them too unpredictable for our galaxy." She looked at the Vreth ambassador when she said the next part. She said, "Suggest that if this species is too unpredictable for us, then we have allowed our galaxy to become too small for what is possible." She stopped speaking. She walked back to her position. The room was silent for a long time after she finished. The vote was called. The motion was defeated, 44 votes to 3. The 3 votes in favor were the Vreth and 2 of their closest allied species. Every other delegation voted against. Several of them, including species that had never expressed any particular interest in humanity, voted against by a wider margin than anyone had expected. In the gallery, Corporal Reyes looked at Marcus and said nothing. She did not need to. Ambassador Singh stood on the floor below, and she did not allow herself to show how she felt, because she was a professional. But later she would describe the moment as the strangest and most overwhelming of her career. She said it felt like watching a door open that she had not known was there. Marcus watched the queen move through the departing crowd, tall and unhurried, surrounded by her guards. At one point, across the full width of the conclave floor, the queen turned her head, and her compound eyes found him in the gallery, without appearing to search. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away and kept walking. Marcus sat back in his seat. The junior diplomat next to him let out a long, shaking breath. Marcus understood how he felt. The conclave ended 4 days later. In those 4 days, Marcus Hale was teased without mercy by every single member of the human delegation. It started with Corporal Reyes, who said nothing for a full day, and then started calling him Ambassador Stunning whenever no senior officer was in earshot. It spread from there. The junior diplomats had a field day. Even Ambassador Singh, who maintained the dignified composure of a career diplomat in all official settings, was observed smiling quietly to herself on at least 3 separate occasions when someone mentioned the incident near her. The story spread beyond the human delegation too. Other species had their own versions of it, filtered through their own translators and their own cultural frameworks, and most of them got some of the details wrong. The Dreshkai version had Marcus delivering a formal challenge that the Queen had accepted as a sign of warrior spirit. The Solari version had him performing a ritual breeding they did not have a name for. The Vreth version, which circulated among their own delegation in private channels, simply called it further evidence of human unpredictability, which Marcus thought was at least accurate. The incident was given a name in Earth's diplomatic records before the conclave even ended. Someone in the foreign ministry with a sense of humor filed it under the Hale Overture. It was later added to the curriculum at Earth's Diplomatic Academy as a case study in what happened when sincere human instinct collided with formal galactic protocol. The accompanying notes described it as an accidental breakthrough and noted with some understatement that it should probably not be attempted deliberately. On the last morning of the conclave, Marcus received a message. It was not sent through any diplomatic channel. It came directly to his personal communicator, routed through the station's internal system, and it carried the authentication seal of the Zythari Queen's personal office, which was a seal that had never before appeared on a communication sent to a human being. It said, "Come to the East Observation Deck before the morning session." He went. She was already there when he arrived. The East Observation Deck was a long room with one full wall made entirely of clear material, looking out directly into space, and at that hour the station's position gave a clear view of the star they were orbiting, small and brilliant and impossibly far away. The Queen was standing at the window. She was alone. No guards in the room, though Marcus was certain they were close. He crossed the room and stood beside her and looked out at the same star she was looking at, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then she held out her hand. In it was a small object. It was crystal, roughly the size of his fist, and it was dark at the moment, but as she held it, the light from the star caught it, and it lit from inside, and the color it made was exactly the same shifting violet-black as her carapace. She said, "This is a memory shard." She said, "My people use them to preserve the consciousness echo of our most important moments." She said, "We have given them to other Zythari." She said, "We have never given one to an outsider." She placed it in his hand. She said, "This shard holds the moment I heard your words in the corridor." He looked at the crystal in his palm. He said, "Why that moment?" She said, "Because it is the first time in 200 years that I experienced something I could not name." He stood there holding a piece of the Queen's memory in his hand, and he did not know what to say, so he said the only true thing he could find. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Ask me your last question." He looked at her. He said, "How do you know I have one?" She said, "You have had it since the corridor." He thought about not asking it. He thought about it for about 4 seconds. Then he said, "Was I right?" She said, "About what?" He said, "Are you stunning?" The star outside burned quietly in the dark. The Queen of the Zythari Empire stood at the window of the observation deck of a station orbiting a nameless star, and she was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "Ask me again in a century." She said, "I suspect I will have a better word by then." She walked to the door. At the threshold, she paused. She said without turning, "Do not lose the shard, Sergeant." Then she was gone. Marcus stood alone at the window, holding a piece of violet-black crystal that held a queen's memory of a moment that had no name. And he looked out at the star, And he thought about a child feeding pigeons, and about his mother laughing, and about the fact that humanity had walked into the most important diplomatic event in its history as a footnote, and was leaving as something else entirely. He did not know what word to use for what it was leaving as. He thought that was probably all right. He thought that was maybe even the point. 6 months later, back on Earth, a professor at the Diplomatic Academy stood in front of a room full of new students and told them about a sergeant who had whispered 5 words on an open comm channel and accidentally changed what humanity meant to the rest of the galaxy. She told them it was not something they should try to replicate. Then she told them what it meant. She said, humanity had been trying to prove it belonged among the stars by showing what it could do. She said what changed everything was showing what it could feel. She paused. Then she said, remember that. Somewhere across the galaxy, in a chamber deep in the Zythari homeworld, a small dark crystal sat on a shelf, and held in perfect stillness the echo of a queen's first nameless feeling, and the memory inside it was still warm.